Well, good morning. It's Monday, May 31st, the last day of the month. Gathered for morning devotion again, Hebrews for Everybody by N.T. Wright. Today's chapter and verses are 8, 7 through 13. If the first covenant had been faultless, you see, there wouldn't have been any reason for a second one. God finds fault with them when he says, "See, says the Lord, the days are coming when I will complete with the house of Israel, with Judah's house, also a covenant that's new, not like the one which I made with your ancestors on the day when I reached out and took him by the hand that led him away out of the land of Egypt. That didn't remain after all in my covenant. And, says the Lord, I cease to care for them. This is the covenant I will establish. After those days in the house of Israel, my law will I place in their minds, says the Lord. I will write it on their hearts. Thus I shall be God for them of me. They'll be my people indeed. No more will they need to instruct one another or teach their own neighbors to know me, the Lord. For at least until greatness, each one shall know me. For I shall be merciful to their injustices, and for all their sins I will forget them forever." Thus, when it speaks of a new covenant, it puts the first one out of date, and something that is out of date and growing old is about to disappear. One of my favorite rivers is the Kotek, which rises in the heart of many native parts of England. It runs down the North Sea about 50 miles south of the border of Scotland. It isn't a long river, even by national standards, let alone compared with the great rivers in Europe, still less mighty the Amazon or the Mississippi River or the Missouri. But at every point, it has character and style. It begins as a bubbling mountain stream collecting water from several sources high in the Pennines. It comes down into a winding valley with pretty little villages and heather-covered hills. As it gets wider, so its valley gets deeper, passing into ancient monasteries which we'll still use as a place of prayer and pilgrimage, and going down into gorges lined with leafy trees. As it reaches the sea, it comes under the shadow of an ancient castle, and as though to celebrate this arrival as its destination, opposite its mouth is a small island, which serves as a bird sanctuary. Many brooks and streams from several different hills contribute to it. Its character develops and changes as it goes to and fro. Many parts of it offer excellent fishing, and plenty of wild creatures find homes nearby. It remains a single river, moving purposely to its goal, even though you would hardly have guessed from the trickling stream how deep a cutting it would actually make. Just as someone who only knew its final stretch, broadening to meet the incoming tide, would not easily imagine the steep rocks and hills where it all began. We are nearly halfway through the book of Hebrews, as the thought of a letter is now going to cut deep into some rich theology. This is a good moment to look back over the route we have taken. Think back to the first exciting and even bubbly celebration of the greatness of the Messiah over against the angels. Reflect on the many turns and twists of the biblical passage that have been called on and expounded to the point we have now looked at. Look on as well to the conclusion, the point where the now powerful river runs into the sea, making a unique contribution to a larger reservoir of Christian wisdom. As will be obvious from a glance at the present passage, we are now faced with the longest single biblical quote we've had so far, in a book which has more than its fair share of them. This is an important clue as to how we should understand the flow of the book as a whole. In particular, how the different streams of thought that contribute to the river play its part in making it is what it is. Remember how we noticed not long ago that the word better occurs more in Hebrews than the rest of the New Testament put together. That too provides a clue. What the writer is doing is choosing passages from the Old Testament would say, in effect, what we have is good, but God is doing something better. What we have is true, but it isn't the whole truth. What we know at the moment is important, but the most important thing we know is that God is planning to do something more, and that the whole letter is written in order to say that something more, the whole truth, the better thing has now arrived in Jesus. So whatever you do, don't go back to the old things. However good and true they are now taken up in the new and better. Otherwise, you look like something trying to pump water from the river back into the various smaller streams for which it came. It can't be done. You must go where the river is taking you, even though it's traveling into countrysides you never expected. Look back over the significant streams that have made the river what it is. We began in the first few chapters with a flurry of biblical passages, all designed to say that Jesus, the Messiah, was God's only Son, and is such greatly superior to the angels who gave the law. This blended with the discussion of Psalm 8 in chapter 2, where it became clear that Jesus is truly human being who had already attained the sovereignty over creation which God intended for the whole human race. Then in chapter 3 and 4, the writer took us into a different world that Psalm 95 insisted that according to the psalm itself, there is still a Sabbath rest waiting for God's people, something for which the entry into the promised land was just an advanced picture. This was meant to stimulate the readers into realizing that they must make every effort to hold firmly to their faith and hope. The mood then shifts at the end of chapter 4 as Hebrews focus on Jesus as a high priest, where we thus turn to Psalm 110, which it mentions of Jesus as a high priest according to the order of Melchizedek. This has been the fullest example so far of the way the writer has used the Bible, finding a passage which points beyond itself, beyond its own time, to reality yet to come. From early in chapter 5 to the middle of chapter 8, in the last passage we looked at, this has been the central theme, including a sharp word of warning about how important it is to grow up and be prepared to take the strongest meat of detailed biblical truth. And this discussion of Jesus' priesthood has brought us to the point where, as we noted, the longest biblical quote of the entire letter can be found. The promise in Jeremiah chapter 31, verses 31 and 34, that God will make a new covenant to replace the one made with Moses. These quite different phrases of letters, like the different stretches of the river, each have their own character, but it's important to see the way in which each follows unnaturally from the previous one, forming one single argument. To change the image quite drastically, it's a bit like a wedding cake, with each layer carefully positioned on top of the previous one, except that, whereas the wedding cake normally has smaller layers, the higher you go, in this letter, it's the latter layers that get larger and larger and larger. Jesus is the Messiah, God's Son, superior to the angels and hence the law. He is truly human being, and he is offering us true rest, which goes far beyond what the Israelites expected from their exodus. In fact, as the Messiah, he is the high priest who has accomplished what the ancient priesthood has never been able to do. Now, as a result of this, we see that in him, God has fulfilled one of the most central and vital purposes of all. He has established in Jesus a new covenant, spoken of by Jeremiah. And just as Psalm 95 continued to be the vital text of chapters 3 and 4 and 110, from chapters 5 through the middle of 8, so Jeremiah 31 continues to be the writer's mind and should be on ours as well. All the way from this point on to the end of chapter 10, many other streams of thoughts come into the river, and we shall take note of them as they do so. But the countryside we are now in is a new covenant territory. And the point Hebrews wishes above all to make is that the new covenant, as we'll see in verse 12, is that through its sins have been at last forgiven. With this, the previous covenant, temple, priesthood for all, are all out of date and about to disappear. That is the most powerful argument yet for the importance of holding on to Jesus instead of going back to the apparent safety of Judaism. If God has established a new thing, he has already promised to go back to the old foolish will be disloyal. So what he's saying is, the writer is building an argument, and he starts out as Jesus the Messiah, and he's kind of building an upside-down wedding cake. The arguments get bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And we're at the point right now, almost halfway through, that the biggest argument is made. That everything that the writer was saying was building up to this point that in Jesus Christ, we are given a new covenant. So for first century Jews, for them to hear this new covenant written on your heart, to go back to the old covenant of Jesus, or of the law of Moses, would be disloyal. Because now that we have faith in Jesus and we have seen the ministries of Jesus, and the writer of Hebrews has proven that Jesus is better than the law of Moses, now we have that layer of the new covenant that God has made between us and him. And that new covenant is better than the old covenant. The old covenant was good. The new covenant is better in and through Jesus Christ. And one of the ways you can tell is because the old covenant had been destroyed when the temple was destroyed. There is no longer a place to worship. But yet Jesus is still alive. Jesus is still with us. Therefore, that covenant is better. So we're continuing on these arguments. We'll see what the next layer in chapter 9 has for us. Go forth this day in the peace and the love of Christ.